everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. It's November 2018, and you're listening to episode 99 of Postmodern Realities, and I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. On this episode, I'm joined by Bob Perry, who has an MA in Christian Apologetics from Biola University and is also a speaker with the Life Training Institute. In a past issue of the Christian Research Journal, Bob wrote an effective evangelism article for us, and it's now free online at our website, equip.org. Our effective evangelism column is a column that has articles of practical advice on how to reach people of other faiths and of no faith with the gospel. And his article is called Taking Jesus to Work. Bob, it's good to have you on.
Good to be here, Melanie. How are you?
I'm doing great. Well, your article was about evangelism in the workplace. So can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote the article?
Well, actually, evangelism in the workplace is what got me started in the world of apologetics in the first place. I make my living as a commercial airline pilot. And one night, many years ago, I was in the cockpit on a red eye from Las Vegas to Cincinnati with a guy who was an avowed atheist. Now, at that point in my life, I had been brought up as a Christian. I'd always considered myself a Christian. I was attending church regular with my wife and two kids, and very interested and engaged in my church, and studied the Bible, all that stuff. But this guy started asking me questions that I had never been asked before, and I'd never actually met a person who admitted to be an atheist, so I was kind of caught off guard. And he wasn't rude or anything, but he just was relentless. He just kept pounding away with the questions. And at one point, can't remember what prompted it, but at one point he said, "Okay, well, tell me why. Why do you believe in God?" And I just remember staring out the window of the cockpit that night, wondering how to answer that question. No one had ever asked me that before. And it kind of caught me off guard because I didn't have any way to answer. So the way evangelism comes into this is I was actually kind of reverse evangelized by realizing that I didn't own my own faith. I was just had the faith of that my parents had brought me up in. And so it set me off on the journey into the apologetic world. But I bring that story up because I was caught off guard. I was at work. I wasn't expecting to talk about religious issues, or I wasn't even considering the idea of evangelism. And I had absolutely no positive input about Christianity to this guy, apparently, because he wasn't buying a word I was saying. So that's when you talk about evangelism in the workplace, the point of me writing the article is that I think we have to be ready for encounters like that, especially now, many years later. The world we live in, you will be challenged, and you need to be ready to respond.
Well, as an airline pilot, I think that your work environment is unique from most people in just the workplace. And so, most people are in an office setting, although not always, but they're in kind of, more of an interactive environment with a whole bunch of people as opposed to just one person for a bunch of hours going, in a small environment. So how do you think your experience and your unique work environment can apply to most of us who have a different workplace than you do?
Well, yeah, I mean, I in my work environment, I have a captive audience for several days at a time, so I can be very patient about how I talk about these things. But I think it applies to everybody because, as I kind of said earlier, you have to be ready for this kind of encounter. People, I think, have a wrong view of evangelism, that it's something that you go knock on doors, or you go stop people on the street, or yell through a megaphone on a street corner, whatever, that's evangelism. And I think, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, I think, but we have to be effective evangelists. An evangelist is someone who brings good tidings, is the definition of the Greek word that we translate as evangelist. So we have to be able to do that wherever we are. In fact, most of us, and me included, we're not allowed to proselytize at work. We're not allowed to bring up religion and start getting into religious conversations with people just to try to win them over to our side. So there has to be a way that we're prepared in a different way to evangelize, and I think I don't want to use the word passive, but it's more more laid back, I guess, and more open to what other people are going to say, because you're not going to be the only one talking. Um, that's kind of what I brought away from this. My experience with this is that when First Peter, the great apologetics verse, that we should always be ready to give an answer, that means at work too. And even if you're not allowed to proselytize, you still should be prepared for these kinds of encounters in the environment, in the culture that we live in.
Now, you said you're not allowed to proselytize, and that's probably true for most workplaces. So, in that first situation, the first time you ever talked to someone, on that flight who was an atheist, did he bring it up was it somebody that you knew, or was it more, oh, this is an assignment, the first time you ever met this person?
I had actually met him before, but we'd never talked about religious issues. I honestly don't remember what started the conversation, but it quickly escalated into him challenging me, because he asked whatever he asked. I told him I was a Christian, and he wanted to know why I believed in Christianity. He had all kinds of bad uh, things to say about Christianity, what Christians had done over the years, how Christians were hypocrites, all that kind of stuff. So I was basically trying to fend him off, and but when it came down to actually explaining why I was a Christian, that's where I fell short. And I think that's a very common thing. When I teach classes nowadays, I'll ask people when I start up the class the same question this guy asked me: why do you believe in God? And it's you barely get a response. People will not make eye contact, they'll look away. It's a hard question for people to ask, especially if they've been in the church their whole life and never been challenged like that.
Well, a few minutes ago, you were talking a little bit more about we have to be prepared to be evangelists. And I think the stereotype of an evangelist is either some, famous pastor in front of a large crowd, or like you were describing, somebody on a street corner just with a megaphone, then people are trying to ignore as they walk quickly by. So can you describe more for us, elaborate on what you mean specifically about Christians having to be evangelists?
Yeah, like I said, the definition of the word is a bringer of good tidings. So we should be able to be bringers of good tidings no matter where we are. And I think we've gotten this idea in our head that an evangelist is somebody like Billy Graham, kind of like what you just said, where you go out and try to engage people to make your case on your terms. But that's not the way it works in the culture we live in now. We can be we can be a bringer of good tidings in a different way now. And I think the distinction is, if you look at Ephesians 4:11, it talks about Paul's talking about how the body is equipped, and he said some are made to be teachers and some are evangelists. And there's a distinction there made between apostles and evangelists. Evangelists seem to be almost more technically, the way the way Paul uses it there is that technically they're the people who build up people within the church. Um, and so I think it's interesting that we've made evangelism something that you go out and do. There are people who become evangelists. Uh, the biblical definition for someone who does that is more apostles. The apostle means sent out one. So we've kind of confused what those terms mean, and I think because of that, we think that evangelists are somebody else. We're just your regular Christian. We may think we have a commitment or a obligation to evangelize in some way, but we think we do that on our own terms, where we go out and actively approach people. So I think that the way we've thought about it as an evangelist, is someone who goes out and does something, is where we've gotten it wrong. I think we should be always ready to be a bringer of good tidings.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Bob Perry, and he wrote an effective evangelism article, which is free online at our website, equip.org. And his article is called Taking Jesus to Work. To read more practical evangelism articles like this one, please subscribe to our journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50. And to subscribe online, visit equip.org. And we're headed into the holidays because it's the end of November. And so I would like to ask you to think about giving a subscription to the journal to a friend of yours, your pastor, or a family member who would enjoy these in-depth articles that will equip you in a lot of different areas, including the one of evangelism. Well, in your article, you talk specifically about the Great Commission. And if some of our listeners are not familiar with that, that's a term usually referring to Jesus talking about what we're calling the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20. So can you talk to us a little bit more about the Great Commission?
Yeah, the Great Commission is Jesus' words just before he ascended into heaven. I'll just quote it. Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age." So that's the Great Commission. We're all called to do that. We're all obligated to participate in that. But I think going along with what I've said already is we believe that evangelism is he's telling us to go. That Jesus, the Great Commission, is that we should go. And so we think of that as we have an active thing where we have to go out there and knock on doors or whatever it is. But I don't think that's the point. The objective of the Great Commission is to make disciples. And so the verbs that are used there, go and baptize and teach, to go along with making disciples, are all in the what's called the Greek aorist tense. Now, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I just have read about what this means. And what it means is something not in the past or in the future, but something that's ongoing. So the idea is that we're to make disciples as we're going about living our lives. It's not a separate special thing that you go out and do. It's just something that you do as you are out in the world trying to make disciples. In other words, evangelism isn't a mission in itself, but it's a project we undertake as we are going, as we are living out our lives.
I think most of the time when you talk about evangelism and going, most Christians think of missionaries. So like somebody's going to go evangelize some place where there are not as many church people. I mean, there's a lot of places now in Europe, for example, that don't have as many church people as they had in the past. So even if you I'm going to go be a missionary in Paris or London or something like that, it's like either short-term or long-term endeavor. So how do you apply this idea of going to something we do every day, which is get up and go to work, as some place that we might be doing evangelism?
Yeah. When I was in the position I was in those many years ago in the cockpit with that whole story, I never considered myself an evangelist. In my mind, there were, for lack of a better word, there's professionals who do that. There's the Billy Grahams of the world are the evangelists. So I didn't think of myself as that kind of person. I was just a lay believer who lived my life as a Christian. So the scenario that I was in is why that actually got things turned upside down, because this guy was actually evangelizing, if you want to use that for an atheist, trying to convince me that I should be an atheist. And he wasn't someone like when you just said we go out, you think of missionaries going out to tell people the gospel. This wasn't a guy who'd never heard the gospel. He had heard the gospel. In fact, he'd heard it many times and he rejected it. So it wasn't like I was going to teach something about the gospel, although, I mean, obviously, there are many people who claim they have heard the gospel and know what it is and don't really understand it. But it wasn't like I was in a conversation with somebody who knew absolutely nothing about it. So here he was. He did know the gospel and rejected it, and I was out there passively thinking I wasn't an evangelist, and that's how the tables got turned completely upside down. This wasn't what you would think of as an evangelistic encounter, as at least at that point in my life. I would have never thought of being at work, just having a conversation with somebody as an evangelistic encounter, but that's ended up exactly what it ended up being.
So if we don't think of ourselves in that way, why do you think people are misunderstanding their role of being an evangelist in the workplace? I'm sure when they get up to go to work, they're not thinking, again, as I said, that, oh, I'm going to go today and be an evangelist at work, especially if there's all kinds of company policies not to talk about religious beliefs.
Right. And I think a lot of this stuff, this kind of thinking, you can trace back to the Enlightenment, when the culture, the academia, the people who were in charge of the world started deciding that the scripture was too oppressive, the church was too corrupt, and that we, at the same time, science was rising in popularity and effectiveness. So people started to say, well, we can make the world better on our own. We don't need this revelation from God anymore. You people with the revelation are the ones who are making all the mess. And so the Enlightenment became this idea that human reason was the way we were going to fix the world. And if your listeners have ever read Francis Schaeffer, he was a master at talking about this. What it created was a split. He called it a two-story world, where things like facts and science and the physical world were something that we were public, that we could all touch, see, hear, taste, smell. That was the real world. But things like values and faith and religion and spirituality were things that we couldn't physically see. So those got separated into what Schaeffer called the upper story. And in the upper story, you could believe that stuff. You could believe religious stuff, but it was kind of an irrational leap to go up there and think about that kind of stuff. The leap of faith, you might say. And so we started to split our world into this. There was the religious, spiritual world, and then there was the physical, scientific world. And evangelism, if you're thinking about doing evangelism, that goes into the upper story, as Schaeffer would call it, the place where spiritual and religious things go. And we're not supposed to go there with other people. That's just a private thing that we do. So I think if you want to really trace it back philosophically, it goes all the way back to the Enlightenment, where we started to separate out our faith life from what people would say our real life. And so the public things that we do weren't allowed to coexist or to interact with the private things that we thought about religious or spiritual things.
I do want to tell our listeners, if you want to find out more about the life of the late Francis Schaeffer, we have an article that we wrote about him, and it's free on our website. And the article is called Francis Schaeffer, Pastor, Evangelist, Apologist, Prophet. And if you search for that on equip.org, you'll be able to find an in-depth article more about his life. I agree with you. I think I've mentioned on this podcast before in other episodes that because of that shift in the Enlightenment, it's like people have things in two different buckets. So if you want to talk to them about anything spiritual or prayer, or even in the mind of the Christian, we tend to separate these things, right? We think on one
Absolutely.
side, there's facts and reason and science. And then on the other side, there's spirituality or God working in my life or prayer, which I don't know that I completely trust. But on this other side, we know we can trust reason and science and so forth. So what do you think are the repercussions of this philosophical point of view? I mean, I think, as I just said, I think there's even repercussions for Christians too in our thinking.
Oh, absolutely. You just took the words right out of my mouth. I think that kind of thinking isn't just in the culture, just out in the world. It's in the church. And one of the most obvious things, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, is that we talk about people who are in full-time ministry. And if you think about that for a second, what does that mean? That means it's what I believed when I said, I'm not an evangelist. There are professionals who do that. We think that way about all kinds of church ministry, because people who go and work full time at a church or whatever it is, that because they're paid staff, then they earn their paycheck that way, that they're the professionals and we leave the professional stuff to them. Well, that idea would have been completely incoherent to Paul or any of the apostles. I mean, Paul was a tent maker. He earned his living as a tent maker, but he was out doing the gospel work uh, as a passion of his. It was part of his life. He never would have separated those two things: his work life and his professional life, and his life as an evangelist. In fact, one of his greatest evangelistic success stories was in the Agora in Athens, when he got into a conversation with a bunch of the spiritual and philosophical leaders in Athens, and showed them the gospel, told them that, this God that you seem to be looking for, I know who he is. It's Jesus Christ, and he was resurrected. And it says some of the people who were listening to him said, we want to hear more about this. Paul knew their culture as well or better than they did. He knew their philosophers. He knew their authors. He knew their poets. He quoted them to him. So he was interacting with their world in the marketplace, literally the marketplace in Athens, which was also he made it a marketplace of ideas. He was showing new ideas to people. So my point out of all this is that this Enlightenment idea, where we've separated out and the professional full-time ministers are the ones who are supposed to be doing this, lets us off the hook as so-called lay people. But here's the thing: if you're a Christian, you are in full-time ministry. It doesn't matter if you get your paycheck from a church; you are in full-time ministry just by the fact that you're a Christian. And so witnessing in the workplace isn't something that some other person goes out and does. It's just what you do as you go along, as I said, the Great Commission. As you're living your life, you're engaging in conversations all the time. And that is where evangelism can happen best, I think.
So can you give our listeners maybe a couple ideas, some practical ideas about how to approach this? I think none of us, want any kind of conversation to feel forced or unnatural, or feel like we're on, some crusade to bring up religious stuff at work, which might not go over well. But how can we just be more intentional, be more proactive to remind ourselves that God has placed us in our workplace for a reason, and that there will be opportunities for us to talk to people about spiritual things?
Yeah, I mean, just practically, we have to be more open to it. I think we have to change the way we think about what an evangelist is. So that's kind of an internal thing, but practically, the most effective thing that I've found is asking questions. You can, when people say things, you just have to be aware and open and listening. And when an opening's there, ask a question. I mean, an example is to ask somebody, "What do you think happens when you die?" You can. I've asked people that question and gotten some crazy answers, and I've gotten people who've said, "Oh, wow, I never really thought about that." So that can lead in all kinds of different directions. But just in general, the idea of asking questions is disarming. It takes the onus off you to have to explain things. It makes whoever you're talking to, they have to explain why they claim to believe. If I had known what I know now, this atheist uh, fellow pilot I was flying with, I would have asked him why he was an atheist. Why does he not believe in God? And if he found that Christianity was true, would he believe in God? See what he says. See if he's even open to Christianity. Asking questions also allows you to think. So you can, while they're formulating their answers, you can listen to what they're saying and address what their actual problems are or questions are that you can try to answer, instead of just throwing out something that you think they need to hear. You can answer the questions they actually have. A couple other things I would say: don't use Christianese. Don't use the kind of language you use at church, about we were just fellowshipping together, we were just loving on one another, whatever, that kind of stuff. People who are outside the church, that just sounds weird to them. And I think it undermines the evangelism you're trying to do. And in our culture, this is a huge one. Don't make declarative statements. There'll be a time for that. The gospel is truth. We have to be able to proclaim the truth. But in our culture, if for someone to even claim they know the truth is seen as arrogant and exclusivist, and it just makes people turn you off. So we have to try to avoid that. Use questions and conversation and listen to see what their questions are. You can make the declarative statements later on. I mean, Christianity is an exclusive religion, but I'm just saying, to be effective, we can't just shove that in people's face. Going up to somebody on the street corner, or somebody going up to somebody's door and just telling them, "Hey, this is what you should believe," it just doesn't work. It's not effective in our culture.
I do think that asking questions is kind of a natural thing to do. In fact, recently I was visiting, and listeners of this podcast will know one of my kids is in college, and I was visiting my son, and we were going to a gathering of his friends, and he gave us a heads up that none of those students that were going to be there were Christians. And then I got a conversation in the kitchen with one of his friends, and it just happened naturally. I asked him about his family, and then he was saying that one of his siblings went to college, but they ended up going to a Christian college. I said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Are you a Christian?" They're like, "No, but we used to go to church." And so it was really natural. I mean, it didn't,
Right.
I didn't talk too long, but it kind of like just opened up a conversation, even with somebody, I'm a total adult figure to them, just to find out a little bit more about their background. So I know sometimes that seems like, well, that could be awkward, but it really wasn't, because in asking someone about themselves or their background, you can find out things. So, are there any final thoughts that you want to leave with our listeners about this topic of how they can be an evangelist and really, follow the Great Commission in their workplace?
Well, besides what I've already said about being open and realizing that it's something that's ongoing that you should always be ready and willing to do. One thing that I always struggled with when I was younger was that thinking that if you're evangelizing somebody, if you're telling them the gospel, that you have to close the deal, that you have to make them say, fall down on their knees and ask you to baptize them. And I think that's kind of what we have in our minds about traditional evangelism. If that's your goal, you kind of, it's too aggressive in our culture. Obviously, I'm not saying that you don't do that at some point, but you can't start off there, I guess. Don't start off with the idea that I have to close this deal. It might not even be you who actually convinces this person to think about it. You might just be planting a seed that another person is going to pick up on later on. And ultimately, it's not any of us who evangelize anybody. The Holy Spirit is the one who changes their mind and heart. So we're just there to give information, to represent the gospel, and to do our part in where we are with them at that time. And then, if it continues along with that person at another point, that's great, but it might be somebody else who does it. So don't think you have to be the one. J. Warner Wallace, the cold case Christianity detective, he's a detective out in LA who's written several apologetics books. He calls it little baseball. He said, you don't have to hit a home run. Maybe just get a bunt down and hope to get to first base, and that it's a gradual, slow thing. Second thing is that you have total truth on your side. It's hard to see that or to be confident in that sometimes these days, especially if you're talking to somebody who is aggressive like it was with me, an atheist person like that. But the fact is that reality itself reflects the Christian worldview, and we have fewer and fewer people today believe in divine judgment, believe in the supernatural. Years ago, 100 years ago, people actually already believed in that kind of thing. So evangelism, you were closer to them when you were trying to evangelism. Today, they're not even in the same universe as you. So I'm just saying, be patient. We have a better story. Like Paul changed the story in Athens with people who didn't believe in Jesus Christ. We have the better story. We have the truth behind us. So just be patient, do what you can, ask questions, and don't think you have to take it all on yourself to make this person fall on their knees.
I do want to remind our listeners, maybe you're thinking, well, I don't work outside the home, perhaps. Maybe you stay at home with children or something. There's always opportunities no matter where we are in our community, whether we're a student, there's other students, or if we're at home with children, then we have neighbors. Well, finally, I want to end with some fun rapid fire questions for Bob. So, Bob, last week was Thanksgiving. So, apple pie, pecan pie, or pumpkin pie?
Oh, definitely pecan. Definitely pecan.
What's one of your favorite hobbies?
Oh my I don't I'm not really a hobby person. I play golf whenever I can. I like to work out, but I don't really have a hobby. I did last Christmas. My wife got me a guitar, and I am like have zero musical capability or knowledge or anything, but I'm trying to learn the guitar. So maybe that'll turn into my hobby. It's very frustrating so far, though, I have to say.
Well, okay, so pro football or college football? I know you live in a state that has both.
Well, we have pro football in Ohio, but as we say around here, we don't really have it in Cincinnati. It's been a bad 30 years in Cincinnati for pro football, but I'm definitely, I like college basketball, but I like pro football better.
And how old were you when you became a Christian? You talked about growing up in a Christian home.
Yeah, I was brought up Catholic, but I never actually read a Bible for myself until I was 17 years old. And that's when I had a Bill Gothard seminar. That's when I accepted Christ on my own, made my own decision back, a few years ago. We'll say that.
Well, thanks again, Bob, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thank you, Melanie. Have great holidays this coming up.
Well, today's guest is Bob Perry, and he wrote an effective evangelism article, which is free online on our website, equip.org. His article is called Taking Jesus to Work. To read more evangelism articles like his, please subscribe to the journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50, and to subscribe, visit our website, equip.org. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media, like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI, Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. Follow the Bible Answer Man on Instagram, and please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes. And when you rate and review our podcast, it helps others to find our content. So please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged. It's Hank's new audio podcast. You'll follow Hank off the grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.